Up to this point, we've pretty much just thought about individual actors in an economy. One business. How is one business going to be set up? Or one person. Anyway, one decision-making unit. And that's called microeconomics, decision-making at the individual level. What we're going to be doing from now on in the course is called macroeconomics. That is, economics at the level of many decision makers, large groups of decision makers. For example, a state or a country or a continent, but anyway, larger systems. Now, from an individual or microeconomic standpoint, it's relatively easy to measure success, right? If your goal is to have a lot of money, then you can measure your success by how much money you have. If your goal is to have a lot of cats, then you can just count how many. I don't know. But, for each individual person, it's going to be different. For the entire economy, because that's what we're talking about now, the entire economy, it's harder to know what kind of measure to use, what kind of measure of success to have, and we're going to talk about some of the difficulties in that. But the primary statistic that we use is called GDP, or Gross Domestic Product. Now, GDP, Gross Domestic Product, is formally defined by your book as the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in 1 year. But let me explain each of the parts of that. It's in dollars because that's our unit of account, rather than just counting up how many cars were produced and how many houses were built, because you could write an enormous book about that. Instead, we just say, what's the dollar value of all final goods produced in a year? And we count only final goods because we don't want to count things twice. For example, maybe one company produces the tires that will go into a car, and another company assembles the car. All we want to count is the final value of the car. We don't want to count the car and the tires and all the steel that went into it, because that would be double counting, right? We just want to count that one final good that's going to go to the consumer. It's important to note, too, that this only counts new production. Okay, so we're not counting total wealth. You could have no GDP for a year and still be a relatively rich country, theoretically, as long as you had a lot to begin with. So GDP is basically just another way of saying, how much did we produce? How productive were we last year? Okay, and that's what GDP measures. So is it a perfect measure? No, and we're going to talk a little bit about what makes it an imperfect measure. Here's the first thing that makes GDP, just raw GDP, an imperfect measure of economic well-being, which is that, if you look at the GDP of different countries, for example, India versus Australia, India actually has a higher GDP than Australia. But intuition will tell you that the average Australian is better off than the average Indian citizen. And that's because that GDP, that production in India, is divided among roughly 1 billion people. Whereas in Australia, it's divided among roughly 25 million people. So rather than just raw GDP, a better measure of how well your economy is doing is what's called real GDP per capita. I'll get into what the real means in a second, but the per capita means that you actually divide it by the population. Now, the second reason why the raw GDP number, and even just dividing that raw GDP number by the population, isn't sufficient, is that GDP is measured in dollars. And even though measuring it in dollars rather than listing out all the stuff that we produced is the more efficient way of going about things, it turns out that the value of a dollar itself actually will change over time, as you guys know. So we don't want GDP to measure the change in the value of the dollar, because GDP will look like it's really going up really fast if there's a lot of inflation. So we don't want that. So we actually have to adjust that GDP number for inflation, and we're going to talk about later how they do that. But GDP unadjusted for inflation, raw GDP, is called nominal GDP. That is GDP in name only. Whereas GDP that's been adjusted for inflation, in other words, it used some constant base year dollar. So you'll hear maybe, GDP in 2005 dollars, because they want to use 1 year's price level. That's called real GDP. Okay, so we take that raw GDP number, and then once we've divided it by the population and adjusted for inflation, then we get real GDP per capita, and that's the measure that we're going to use. But, of course, there are other imperfections as well. For example, the way that we come up with that GDP number is we either have to add up all the money that people spent in a year or all the money that people earned in a year. And that itself is not perfect because there is a lot of income and there are a lot of expenditures that go unreported during the course of the year, whether because they're just casual transactions like babysitting or if they involve some kind of illegal trade. But those things count as production. So that's not counted in GDP. And there are other reasons why it's imperfect, but that's pretty much our major measure of how well an economy is doing. And we measure growth entirely by changes in GDP. Changes in GDP actually have a distinctive feature, which is that it goes in a cycle. So it'll actually go up and then reach a peak, and then it'll go down again, reach a trough, and then we'll have more expansion. So it goes expansion, peak, contraction, trough, over and over and over again. But in general, if you zoom out from that, it won't look like a cycle. It'll look like a line that's going up. So each peak is higher than the last peak, and each trough is higher than the last trough. So we have long-term, even though we have fluctuations in the short term, in the long term, we have economic growth. Now, hopefully you'll begin to make the connection that all production comes from the factors of production, right? So the more factors of production you have, or the more efficiently you use your existing factors of production, the more production you'll have, the higher GDP you'll have. So where does that long-term economic growth come from, especially on a per capita basis? Well, because it's per capita, it can't come from an increase in the population. It can't come from more labor, because you're just dividing the higher number by a higher number. So that won't help you. So that means that it has to come from something else. Well, it can come from an increase in capital, human and physical, the tools that we have to make things, and the skills and knowledge that we bring to the table. So we do that through education and through various kinds of investment in capital goods and machines and stuff like that. And it can come from resources, but really from a more efficient use of resources that we already have, or new uses for resources that we already have, or entirely new resources that we create, like plastics. And that really relates to technological growth. So on the one hand, we're always trying to push that GDP number higher so that we're better off. But as you may imagine, that's not the only economic goal that we have, right? We have a lot of other economic goals, and one of the most important ones is stability. We like growth, but we also know that there is this business cycle thing, and just having a lot of growth doesn't mean that there's not a lot of volatility in that cycle. So we want policies that will stabilize that cycle, that will make the troughs easier to handle, and maybe those peaks a little less crazy. So we don't want, this kind of thing. We want something a little more of a steady line. So we want that stability. Because in contractions, people tend to get laid off. And in expansions, for reasons that I'll talk about in the future, we tend to see inflation. So we want to have that level off a little. But stability isn't just important when it comes to the business cycle, when it comes to that cycle of GDP going up and then down. It also refers to price level, because we know that there is such a thing as inflation and its opposite, deflation. And we want that to be relatively close to zero. We don't want deflation at all, and we don't want very much inflation. Now, if everybody's wages go up by 100%, then it doesn't matter that all the prices in the economy also go up by 100%, right? It doesn't make any difference to you. The only reason why inflation can be bad when it gets to high levels is because it creates uncertainty in the economy. And when there's that kind of uncertainty, investors stop wanting to invest and the economy stops growing. There's also a potential that you could see strong economic growth in a country, and this is relatively unlikely, but you could see strong economic growth in a country and a lot of wealth in a country, but high levels of unemployment. And we don't like that. We want everybody to be employed. It's inefficient not to have everybody employed, right? You want to be using all of your labor, but also that's how people earn a living. And that brings us to the last thing, which is inequality. Just because a country has a high GDP per capita, a high real GDP per capita, doesn't mean that everybody in that country is relatively well off. The United States is one of the richest countries in the world, and we're also relatively equal, but some of the other countries that are extremely wealthy are so because of something like oil. So we're thinking here about like the United Arab Emirates or Qatar, and a lot of these societies are very unequal in terms of their income distribution, and that can be really bad. I mean, just from a compassion standpoint, we want everybody to have the necessities, the basic necessities of life. So inequality and poverty are two other issues that are not addressed just by GDP. There are two other macroeconomic goals that we want to address. Hopefully you can tell that this is a very brief, very general overview of macroeconomics, macroeconomic goals, macroeconomic problems. And so I want to encourage you not simply to rely on this video. You need to read the book sections for this. You need to be aware of some of the specifics of what are going on here. But this is just to give you an idea of some of the considerations that we're going to be talking about this chapter or this unit and over the next unit as well.